Fanatics, welcome to Diamond Painting Fanatics. I am Cindy and today is Thriller Thursday, which means we're going to talk about a true crime episode. I don't want to say story because they're not stories, they actually happened. Yes, I hope you enjoyed the new theme tune for Thriller Thursdays. I just wanted to pop on and just forewarn you that this episode has everything. It is long. I think it's 2 hours and some because I'm taking up more of your time. But I wanted to forewarn you that it has murder, including children. It has abuse, physical, mental and sexual, and to children. These are two very repulsive, evil, nasty people. I remember this case, I think I was leaving secondary school around this time. I was in secondary school. I left in 95. But yes, I remember it being on every newspaper, all over the TV, magazine, everywhere. It was his and her face was everywhere, and it was horrific from what I could remember of it. Now that I delved into it, it was even worse. So I just wanted to forewarn you because I know I have a very morbid curiosity into these cases, but this was one of the hard ones that I've had to read and digest. I do make comments along the way, but yeah, I hope you enjoy. No, that's the wrong terminology. I hope I keep your interest. I hope you grab whatever you are working on and feel free to come join me. I would love to have you join me. If you have any suggestions on who you would like me to talk about in an upcoming episode, leave it in the comments. I have said that along the video. If you're here at the end, let me know in the comments. So throughout the video I kind of say that. So yeah, I shall let you get to your episode because that's what you've clicked to see, not me. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it. And if you're into diamond painting or crafting, you don't have to diamond paint, listening to my Thriller Thursday episodes, please hit that subscribe button. I would love to have you join me on my channel. I also do unboxings and lots of happy stuff, not always such morbid. Only on Thursdays do we discuss crimes. Okay, I shall let you get to it. Thank you, and I shall see you very soon, guys. Bye. This is the true life crime of Fred and Rosemary West. Now, I remember growing up and seeing their faces on TV, on newspapers, on magazines. It was everywhere, and it was horrific, absolutely horrific. And I've tried to do this story a couple of times, and that's why I've decided to summarise it, because yeah, I'm just gonna get on with this because it's quite bad. So, Fred West was born on the 29th of September 1941 in Herefordshire. He was the first surviving child born to Walter and Daisy. They were from a poor family of farm workers who were close-knit, mutually protective. His father was the strict disciplinarian and his mother was really overprotective. So in 1946 they moved to Moorcourt Cottage, where they live on a farm, and by 1951 Fred's mother has given birth to 8 children, 6 of whom survived. But Fred was always the mummy's boy. He was her favourite. So Fred claimed that he was introduced to sex by his mother at the age of 12, and he engaged in acts of bestiality with animals in his early teens, and that he believed that incest was normal, and this stemmed from his father's abuse to his sisters. But Fred's younger brother Doug said this was complete fantasy on Fred's part. None of that ever happened. By 1957, Fred and his brother John frequently went to a youth club. And he aggressively pestered women and girls whom he objectified as sources of pleasure to be used as he saw fit. He would approach them and fondle them. He was out for himself. He didn't care if the girl enjoyed herself or not, to put it mildly. Shortly after his 17th birthday, Fred bought a motorcycle, and 2 months later he suffered a fractured skull, a broken arm, a broken leg in an accident. He was unconscious for 7 days and walked with braces for several months. He developed an extreme fear of hospitals and became prone to fits of rage. 2 years later, Fred suffered a further head injury when a girl he groped on a fire escape outside a youth club punched him, sending him falling 2 floors. In June 1961, Fred's 13-year-old sister, Kitty, told her mum that Fred had been raping her since the previous December and had impregnated her. Arrested the same month, Fred freely admitted to police that he had been molesting young girls since his early teens and asked, "Doesn't everybody do it?" He was tried on the 9th of November, and although Daisy had been disgusted by her son's actions, she had been prepared to testify in his defence. Kitty refused to testify, so the case collapsed. Then much of Fred's family pretty much disowned him, and his mother banished him from the house. And then he moved in with his Aunt Violet. By mid-1962, he had reconciled with his parents, but his relationship with most of his family, funnily enough, remained fraught. Fred became reacquainted with Catherine, who I'm going to call Rena. That was her nickname, but I'll call her Rena. in September 1962 when he was 21. He first met Rena, who came from Coatbridge, Lanarkshire, at a dance hall in 1960. He dated her for several months before she returned to Scotland. Rena was pregnant by an Asian bus driver at the time of her marriage to Fred, and may have relocated from Glasgow to England due to her family not being happy at a mixed-race child. She married Fred on the 17th of November. The only guest was his brother John. The couple lived at his Aunt Violet's home, and then moved to Coatbridge, where Fred worked as an ice cream van driver. Rena's daughter, Charmaine, was born in 1963. And to explain to everyone why the child was mixed race, Rena and Fred, Rena and Fred claimed that she had suffered a miscarriage and that Charmaine was adopted, because that's normal. Shortly thereafter, the couple relocated to Savoy Street in Bridgeton, a district of Glasgow. In July 1964, Rena had Fred's daughter, called Anna Marie. Right, this is where it gets confusing, because, we have the family nanny. Now, you can read this whole article. I've got this on Wikipedia. You can read the whole thing, because I am going to be missing out a lot of graphicness out of this. So, the family nanny, I think you pronounce it Isa McNeil. And the neighbours of the West recall Rena as a considerate mother struggling to bring up 2 children. And that's fair enough, it is difficult. Fred treated the children harshly. He kept the girls in the bottom of a bunk bed with bars fitted to the space between the bunks, effectively caging them in. They were allowed out only when he was at work, via Isa, the nanny. The West became... I'm just going to call her the nanny. There we go. The nanny. The Wests became acquainted with 16-year-old Anne McFall, a friend of the nanny's, who was despondent over the death of her boyfriend in a workplace accident. Anne spent a great deal of time at their house, at their flat. Now this it's not funny. It's not funny. This whole thing is not funny. But Fred later admitted to having engaged in numerous affairs in the early years of his marriage and fathered one illegitimate child. When Rena discovered her husband's infidelity, did she leave? No. She began an affair with a man named John. On one occasion, Fred discovered the pair in an embrace. He punched Rena, making her scream. In response, John punched Fred, who drew a knife and grazed John's abdomen. When punched by John a second time, Fred stopped defending himself. Years later, John recollected the incident. He couldn't tackle a man, but he wasn't slow in attacking women. He and Rena continued their affair, and John became increasingly aghast at Rena's bruises and black eyes. On each occasion, it became apparent Fred had beaten his wife. John extensively beat Fred. Another time, John witnessed Charmaine, who was a little older than a toddler. He saw her ask Fred for an ice cream from his van, and in response, Fred struck her across the head, triggering another beating from John. On the 4th of November 1965, Fred accidentally ran over and killed a small boy in Glasgow with his ice cream van. Fred was cleared of any wrongdoing by police, but feared hostile reaction and potential reprisals for the accident from the locals. And of course, he's selling ice creams, he needs the locals. So they returned to Gloucester with Charmaine and Anna Marie, renting a caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park in Bishop's Cleeve. Rena joined them in February 1966, accompanied by their nanny and Anne, who was her friend, who also moved into Fred's caravan. Shortly after the move south, Fred found employment driving a lorry for a local abattoir. By early 1966, Fred had begun to exhibit dominance and control over all three women. He was also prone to violent mood swings, and Rena and the nanny typically bore the brunt of his fury. Fred also physically attacked his stepdaughter more than once. He was also reported to have begun sexually abusing Charmaine and to have encouraged Rena to turn to prostitution to supplement their meagre income. To escape Fred's domestic abuse and increasingly sadistic sexual demands, Rena phoned John, the guy she was having the affair with, begging him to come rescue her, Nanny and the children. Together, John, Rena, the nanny, devised a plan. He and the nanny's boyfriend, another John, so we'll call him John T, would secretly drive to Bishop's Cleeve in John's Mini and discreetly take Rena, her children and the nanny back to Scotland. Anne by this stage had become infatuated with Fred, who promised to marry her, even though he's married to Rena. It's likely that she informed Fred of the plan, as he arrived at the meeting with Anne being oddly calm, as she informed the nanny she intended to remain with Fred to work as the children's nanny. An altercation ensued between Fred and John, again, resulting in Fred being struck several times as he clutched onto Charmaine and Anna Marie. Police were called and John T, the nanny, and Rena left, with Fred threatening to kill Rena should he ever see her again. She believed her relationship with Fred could offer her a better life than she had experienced in Scotland, and she was trying to persuade Fred to divorce his wife in order that he could marry her. Now we know this isn't going to go well. In 1967, Anne, who was 18 and 8 months pregnant with Fred's child, vanished. She was never reported missing, but her dismembered remains were found buried at the edge of a cornfield in 1994. Quite a while. Her limbs had been carefully disarticulated, and many of her bones from her fingers and her toes, I believe, were missing from her body, likely to have been retained as keepsakes. Her unborn child may have also been cut from her womb. Fred initially denied killing Anne, but confided to one visitor following his arrest that he had stabbed her to death following an argument. This explanation is inconsistent with the fact that her wrists were found with sections of dressing gown cord wrapped around them, suggesting she had been restrained prior to her murder. The following month, Rena returned to live with Fred. Makes you wonder what she thinks happened to Anne. But then they moved to another caravan park. Their relationship initially improved, but Runner left the following year, again leaving the children in his care. On these occasions, when Fred had no woman to supervise or care for the girls, he temporarily placed them into care of social services. And now he meets Rosemary. He first met her in 1969, shortly after her 15th birthday. At first, Rose was repulsed by Fred's unkempt appearance and deduced that he was a tramp, but she quickly became flattered by the attention. She twice refused to go on a date with Fred. In their initial conversations, this is how these people work, Fred quickly discovered that although Rose had never had a boyfriend, she was overtly promiscuous. He also extracted a degree of sympathy from her by claiming he and his 2 daughters had been abandoned by his wife and that he wished for more children. After a short while, Rose began a relationship with Fred, becoming a frequent visitor at the Lake House Caravan Park that he now lived in, and she was a willing childminder to Charmaine and Anna Marie, whom she noted were neglected and whom she initially treated with care and affection. On several occasions in the early days of their courtship, Rose insisted she and Fred take the girls on excursions to gather wild flowers. Within weeks of her first meeting Fred, Rose left her job at the bread shop in order to become the nanny to Charmaine and Anna Marie. This decision was made with the agreement that Fred would provide her with sufficient money to give to her parents on Fridays to convince them that she was still working at the bread shop. Several months later, Rose introduced Fred to her family, who were aghast at their daughter's choice of partner. Rose's mother, Daisy, same name as Fred's mum, was unimpressed with Fred's, I don't even know what that word is, but she correctly concluded that he was a pathological liar. Her father, Bill, a diagnosed schizophrenic who is believed to have molested his daughter, 100% disapproved of the relationship, threatening Fred directly and promising to call social services if he continued to date his daughter. Yeah, they kept dating. Then social services. Okay, so the dad, Bill, calls social services and says, like, this creepy dude is dating my daughter and he's got a couple of kids. And then I'm not quite sure how old Fred is at this point, but he's older than her. And they had heard rumours that Rose was engaging in prostitution. Seems to be a theme with Fred and his girlfriends. In response, Rose was placed into a home for troubled teenagers in August 1969. only allowed to leave under controlled conditions. When allowed to return to visit her parents at weekends, Rose still took the time to visit Fred. On her 16th birthday, Rose left the home for troubled teenagers. And at this time, Fred was serving a 30-day sentence for theft and unpaid fines. Upon Fred's release, Rose left her parents' home to move in to the Cheltenham flat Fred then lived in. A little while later, Fred collected Charmaine and Anna Marie from social services. Bill, the dad, made one final effort to prevent his daughter from seeing Fred. Rose was examined by a police surgeon in February 1970, and they confirmed that she was pregnant. In response, Rose again was placed into care, who was discharged on the 6th of March on the understanding that she would terminate her pregnancy and return to her family. But guess what? Rose instead opted to live with Fred, resulting in her father forbidding his daughter from ever again setting foot in his house. 3 months later, the couple left the Cheltenham flat and relocated to the ground floor flat of a 2-storey house in Midland Road in Gloucester. On the 17th of October 1970, Rose gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Heather Ann. There is speculation that Bill, her dad, was actually the father, but I don't know. 2 months later, Fred was in prison for the theft of car tyres and a vehicle tax disc. He remained in prison until the 24th of June 1971. He served this 6.5-month sentence, Rose having just turned 17 and looking after 3 girls, with Charmaine and Anna Marie being told to refer to Rose as Mother. According to Anna Marie West, she and Charmaine were frequently subjected to criticism, beatings and other forms of punishment throughout the time they lived under Rose's care at Midland Road. Although Anna Marie was generally submissive and prone to display emotion in response to the physical and mental hardships she and her sister endured, Charmaine repeatedly infuriated Rose by her refusal to either cry or display any sign of grief, no matter how severely she was physically punished. Despite the years of neglect and abuse, Charmaine's spirit had not been broken, and she talked wistfully to Anna Marie of the belief that she held that her mummy would come and save her. Anna Marie later recollected, oh dear, her sister, Charmaine, repeatedly antagonised Rose by making statements such as, "My real mummy wouldn't swear or shout at us." A childhood friend of Charmaine's, called Tracy, who lived in the upper flat of Midland Road, she remembered walking into the West's flat unannounced to see Charmaine naked and standing upon a chair, gagged with her hands bound behind her back with a belt, as Rose stood alongside the child with a large wooden spoon in her hand. According to Tracy, Charmaine had been calm and unconcerned, while Anna Marie had been standing by the door with a blank expression on her face. Rose is believed to have killed Charmaine shortly before Fred's prison release date of the 24th of June 1971. She is known to have taken Charmaine, Anna Marie and Heather to visit Fred on the 15th of June. It's believed to be on or very shortly after this date that Charmaine was murdered. As well as forensic odontology confirmed that Charmaine had died while Fred was still incarcerated. Further testimony from Tracy's mother, Shirley, corroborated the fact that Charmaine had been murdered before Fred had been released from prison on the 24th of June. In her later testimony at Rose's trial, Shirley stated that she and her family had lived in the upper flat of 25 Midland Road in 1971, and that her two daughters had been playmates of Charmaine and Anna Marie. Shirley stated that after her family had vacated the upper flat of Midland Road, on one day in June, she had brought Tracy to visit Charmaine, only for Tracy to be told by Rose, "She's gone to live with her mother and bloody good riddance," before Tracy began to weep. Shirley was adamant that Fred was still in prison on this occasion. Rose, she's calling the school, she's telling all her friends that she's gone to live with her mother. I think by claiming that Rena had called and taken her eldest daughter to live in Bristol. I don't think she was ever in Bristol, was she? But Rose explained, and she informed the school that the child had moved with her mother to London. So they're inconsistent stories. But anyway, when Fred was released from prison on the 24th of June, Anna Marie was asking, basically, her dad, and she turned around and said, "Well, how come she took Charmaine but not me?" And he replied, and this is in her autobiography, Out of the Shadows, he replied to her, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong colour." Charmaine's body was initially stowed in the coal cellar of Midland Road until Fred was released from prison. He later buried her naked body in the yard close to the back door of the flat, and he remained adamant that he had not dismembered her. A subsequent autopsy suggesting the body had been severed at the hip. This damage may have been caused by building work Fred conducted at the property in 1976. Several bones, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's the little bones, like the tip of the fingers, them little bones. There's some tiny bones in the wrist, toes and ankles, and they were all missing from her skeleton, leading to the speculation the missing parts had been retained as keepsakes. This proved to be a distinctive discovery in all of the autopsies of the victims. Now, not only have they murdered Charmaine, well, Fred murdered Anne. Now, Rosemary has murdered Charmaine. Then they've told everyone that Charmaine's gone to live with their mum. Now the mum's turned up. Well, that poses a bit of a problem, doesn't it? So basically they have to get rid of her. Well, they don't, but they do. In late August 1971, Rena's turned up to inquire about the whereabouts and the welfare of her children. Fred's sister-in-law, Christine, said that Rena was depressed and extremely anxious about her children's welfare. She then found out that he was living at Midland Road, and she went to confront him, likely to discuss or demand custody of her daughters. This was the final time Rena was seen alive. She is believed to have been murdered by strangulation, possibly in the back seat of Fred's car, while likely intoxicated. When her body was discovered, a short length of metal tubing was found with her remains, leaving an equal possibility she had been restrained and subjected to a sexual assault prior to her murder. Rena's body was extensively dismembered, placed into plastic bags, and buried close to a cluster of trees, known as Yew Tree Coppice at Letterbox Field. So, yeah. And then Fred and Rosemary decide to get married on the 29th of January 1972. So this is August, September, October, November, December. 5 months after he's murdered his wife. Fred incorrectly describing himself as a bachelor. Upon the marriage certificate, no family or friends were invited apart from Fred's brother John. John gets everywhere, doesn't he? He's there all the time. Several months later, Rose was pregnant with her second child. Oh dear. Then they moved from Midland Road to 25 Cromwell Street. Initially, the 3-storey home was rented from the council, but Fred later purchased the property from the council for £7,000. To facilitate the Wests' purchasing of the property from the council, many of the upper floor rooms were initially converted into bedsits to supplement the income. To maintain a degree of privacy for his own family, Fred installed a cooker and a wash basin on the first floor landing in order for their lodgers to not disturb the family on the ground floor. Only he and his family were permitted access to the garden. Yeah, I wonder why that is. On the 1st of June, Rose gave birth to her second daughter. The date of her birth led Fred and Rose to name the child May June. Now, this is where I'm going to summarise, because it basically, shortly after giving birth to their second daughter, Rose began to work as a prostitute, working from a room upstairs at their house. She's advertising her services in the paper, and yeah, she's not only is she being a prostitute, she's engaging in casual sex with both male and female lodgers within their household. So the lodgers and, well, anyone who comes in, basically. Fred also invited friends home from work. She bragged to several people that no man or woman could ever completely satisfy her. When engaging in sexual relations with women, Rose would increase the level of brutality which she subjected her partner to, partially suffocating them, inserting things in them. This is where I'm summarising. If they resisted or expressed any pain or fear, Rose would get more and more excited and make remarks such as, "Aren't you woman enough to take it?" Many of these women, it became apparent Rose and her husband, who often participated in threesomes with his wife, took particular pleasure from seeking to take women beyond their limits. So we're just going to skip all these things because we don't need to know. But basically it's like bondage, restraining devices. And he graphic abuse videos, including with children, so and bestiality. So I'm just going to skip that. You get the idea. Rose controlled the family finances. Fred gave her his pay packets. She had one room in her house called Rose's room, in which there were spy holes so Fred could watch. There was a baby monitor so he could hear wherever he was around the house. He wanted a separate doorbell so that it didn't disturb the family, basically. And then it gets really seedy, because we already know that Rose was probably abused by her father, but he now reappears, and in 1977 he had come to tolerate his daughter's marriage, and he developed a, quote, grudging respect for Fred. When Bill discovered that Rose was a prostitute, he would also... Yeah, you know where I'm going with that. By 1983, she had given birth to 8 children, at least 3 of whom were conceived by clients. Fred willingly accepted these children as his own and falsely informed them that the reason their skin was darker than that of their siblings was because of his great-grandmother was a black woman. Okay, I was talking and my microphone wasn't on. Not that you needed to know that, sorry. Okay, so basically, Rose, she's working as a prostitute. She's mothered 8 children. They're murdering people between themselves, and life must be really stressful. But she hands out severe punishments to the children, bordering on... Yeah. So, between 1972 and 1992, this is so sad. The whole thing is sad. They all are, but between 1972 and 1992, the West children were admitted to the A&E department. In England, we call it accident and emergency. To the local hospitals 31 times. The injuries were explained as accidents and were never reported to social services. Now, this was only in 1992. I say only. It was... Yeah. On one occasion, Stephen was mopping the floor with a cloth when Rose accidentally stepped into the bowl of water he'd been using, and in response, Rose hit the boy over the head with the bowl and repeatedly kicked him in the head and chest, shouting, "You did that on purpose." Yes. There was another time where Rose became furious about missing a kitchen utensil. She then grabbed a knife that she'd been using to cut a slab of meat and repeatedly inflicted light scour marks to May's chest until her ribcage was covered with light knife wounds. All the while she was screaming, "No, Mum, no, Mum." Yeah. Now, in 1972, Anna Marie is now 8 years old, and I'm just going to this brings tears to my eyes, guys. She was 8 years old, and Rose took her down to the cellar, pulled off her clothes, and Fred raped her. And then she just, like, handed her a sanitary towel and said, everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry. Don't say anything to anyone. From that, Anna Marie knew that it wasn't going to be a one-time thing. So, yeah, she threatened to beat them and stuff if ever the abuse was talked about outside of the house. She also sexually abused Anna Marie herself. She encouraged Fred to rape her, and from the age of 13 they were prostituting her out, and the mum would always be in the room. I mean, I can't even imagine how yeah, I can't even imagine. So she is being abused by her mum and dad, and having to sleep with clients. So yeah. In 1972, they hire a 17-year-old girl called Caroline Owens as their nanny. Again, she moves into their house, and she shares a room with Anna Marie, whom Caroline says that she was very withdrawn. Then they explain the steady stream of men by claiming that Rose works as a masseuse, and yeah, they end up abusing her in horrific ways. And after it's so horrific. But they've abused her, they've threatened her, they've done really horrible, degrading things, and then they say, "Oh, do you still want to be our nanny?" And she went, "Well, hang on a minute, that's my escape plan, so yeah, I'll carry on being your nanny." She later managed to escape, and she couldn't bring herself to tell her mum what was going on, but when her mum noticed the welts, bruises, subcutaneous tissue that was exposed on her daughter's body, Caroline burst into tears and told her what happened. Her mum immediately reported it to the police, and the Wests were arrested and charged with assault, indecent assault, actual bodily harm, and rape. And on the 12th of January 1973, the case was tried, but Caroline decided that she couldn't face the ordeal of testifying in court. All charges pertaining to her sexual abuse were dropped, and the Wests agreed to plead guilty to the reduced charges of indecent assault and causing actually bodily harm. And what happened? They were each fined £50, and they walked out of court. When Caroline heard this news, she attempted suicide. 3 months later, the couple committed their first known murder. The victim was 19-year-old Linda Goff, whom Fred and Rose became acquainted with through a male lodger in 1973. Linda regularly visited Cromwell Street and engaged in affairs with two of the male lodgers. They were all at it in this time. On the 19th of April, she moved into their home in Cromwell Street on or about the 20th of April. Other tenants were told she had been told to leave the house after she hit one of their children. This story was repeated to Linda's mother when she contacted the Wests to inquire about where she is. Rose had been wearing Linda's clothing when she repeated this claim. What? When Linda's dismembered body was found, the jaw was completely wrapped in adhesive and surgical tape to silence her screams. The two small tubes had likely been inserted to her nasal cavities, allowing breathing. Long sections of string and sections of knotted fabric were also discovered with her remains. Linda had likely been suspended from holes carved into the wooden beams supporting the ceiling of the cellar. Fred later admitted he had devised for the purpose of suspending his victims' bodies, and likely died of either strangulation or suffocation. Her dismembered body, missing five vertebrae from the lady parts, as well as the usual fingertips and all of that, and was buried in an inspection pit beneath the garage. Oh, I remember that. It was concreted over, wasn't it? God. From their later investigations, police and forensic experts concluded all the victims found in the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street had been murdered in this location, and that, like Linda, each had been dismembered in this location. 5 victims were murdered and buried in the cellar at Cromwell Street between November 1973 and April 1975. The first of these victims, 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, was abducted on the 10th of November 1973. Carol lived in the Pines Children's Home and was abducted after spending the evening at the cinema with her boyfriend. She had been waiting for a bus when she vanished and was likely dragged into Fred's car, where her face was bound with surgical tape and her arms bound with braiding cloth before she was driven to Cromwell Street. Cooper was suspended from the wooden beams of the cellar ceiling before her abuse and murder. As had been the case with Linda, Carol died from strangulation or asphyxiation before her body was dismembered and buried in a shallow cubical grave in the cellar. Over the following 17 months, 4 further victims between the ages of 15 and 21 suffered a similar fate to that endured by Linda and Carol. Although the disarticulation conducted upon each successive victim, plus the paraphernalia discovered in each shallow grave, suggests that each victim was likely subject to greater abuse and torture than those previous. So they're amping up the abuse and torture. Following the murder of 18-year-old, I can't pronounce that, WIPnChat, in April 1975, Fred concreted over the floor of the entire cellar. He later converted this section of the household into a bedroom for his oldest children. Oh my God. And he and his wife are not known to have committed any further murders until May 1978, when Fred, either with or without Rose's participation, but certainly with her knowledge, murdered an 18-year-old lodger named Shirley Robinson. Shirley had taken lodgings in the West in April 1977 and was heavily pregnant at the time of her murder. Although Rose, herself pregnant at the time, initially boasted to neighbours the child Shirley, sorry, they use surnames, I don't like it, that Shirley was carrying was her husband's. She soon developed a deep resentment of Shirley, and the motive for her murder is likely to have been the removal of a threat to the stability of the West's relationship. Yeah, because that's like relationship goals right there. Jeez. I mean, she's fathered like... Oh, yeah, carry on, Cindy. Her body was buried in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. It was extensively dismembered, but no restraining devices were found with these remains, making a sexual motive for the murder unlikely. The unborn baby had been removed and several bones missing. Shortly thereafter, Rose unsuccessfully submitted a claim for maternity benefit in Shirley's name. Jesus. As had earlier been the case with Charmaine and Linda, Fred and Rose, anyone who asked about Shirley's whereabouts, they said that she went to live with her father in West Germany. The final murder Fred and Rose are known to have committed with a definite sexual motive occurred on the 5th of August 1979. The victim was 16-year-old Alison Chambers, who had run away from a local children's home to become the West's live-in nanny in the middle of 1979. Alison is believed to have lived within their household for several weeks before her murder, and Rose promised Alison she could live at the rural peaceful farm she claimed she and Fred owned. Oh my God. Her body was also buried in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. This section is about the abuse that the children have suffered, the West children. And Fred has now turned his attention, or his incestuous sexual attentions, to Heather and Mae West, because Anna Marie ran away from home in 1979 after enduring a particularly severe beating from Rose to her stomach, just days after being discharged from hospital for the treatment of an ectopic pregnancy. Fred was over and unapologetic in his conduct and would justify his actions with the simple explanation, "I made you, I can do what I like with you." I mean, he told them that he wanted to impregnate both his daughters on at least one occasion. He would force them all to watch pornography with him. But basically they've made a pact that if their dad would ask them to be alone in a room, they would only do so if at least one other member of the trio were present to avoid either girl being raped. Both girls also developed a pact whereby they would only shower or undress when their father was either out of the house or if the other sister was standing guard. And then Stephen was also informed by his father that he would have to have sex with his mother by the age of 17. It says that his parents evicted him from their home when he was 16. So, although the girls were repulsed by their father's behaviour, May, having once endured Fred's throwing a vacuum cleaner at her when she remonstrated against his fondling her, developed a mechanism whereby she would tolerate Fred's abuse and jokingly brush aside any effort he made to take it further. Whereas in her autobiography, May recollected that Heather was affected quite badly by all of this, even more than me. A strong suspicion remained that by 1985 or 1986, Heather had been forced to engage in intercourse with her father, as by the mid-1980s she developed classic symptoms of the distress felt by victims of childhood. These included habits of biting her nails until they bled. Crap, I do that. Well, they don't bleed, but they are really, really bad. I didn't know that was a symptom. Drinking alcohol or watching her father through the corner of her eye whenever she was sitting or standing. Oh my God, her sleep being repeatedly broken by nightmares. Yep. And her repeatedly bouncing back and forth as she sat on any chair. Yep. This distressful behaviour led Fred and Rose suspecting Heather had lesbian inclinations, and also resulted in her becoming the increasing recipient of taunts from her father. He's never really liked Heather. Wow, it's his own child. Oh my God. On the occasions Heather whenever she tried to talk to her mum about it, her mum would just laugh because she was so distressed. Heather also expressed to May and Stephen her desire to run away from home and to never see any other human being. That's really, really sad. Heather did complain to friends about the abuse she and her siblings endured, and external signs of psychological distress were noted by several of them. Staff at the secondary school which Heather and her sibling attended are also known to have expressed concern as to why Heather, a studious and obedient pupil, refused to obey orders either to change her clothing for or shower after sporting activities. On one occasion, she was forced to take a shower, resulting in her peers and staff noticing her arms, legs and torso were covered in welts, bruises and in various stages of healing. Heather attempted to excuse these injuries as having been obtained in fights with her siblings, but confided in one close friend that they had been inflicted by her parents, adding that her mother considered her a, quote, little bitch who deserved beatings. By the mid-1980s, rumours of Rose's sex life had reached several of the children's classmates, and although the West's children had been instructed never to divulge details of their home lives to peers, Heather confided to her friends that many of these rumours were true. The father of one of these classmates was a friend of the West's. As such, word soon reached Fred and Rose that Heather had divulged details of her home life, including details of her mother's promiscuity. I didn't say that right, but you know, to her classmates. Fred was so concerned by these revelations that he began to escort Heather to and from school. After Heather left school in 1986, she applied for numerous jobs in an effort to leave Cromwell Street. By June the following year, she had pinned her hopes on escaping the household via obtaining a job as a chalet cleaner at a holiday camp in the seaside town of Torquay. She received notification that this application had been unsuccessful on the 18th of June. In response, she crumpled into tears before her siblings May and Stephen. That same evening, her whole family heard Heather sobbing as she attempted to sleep. She cried all through the night. The following morning, on the 19th of June, Heather was back to her usual self, looking miserable, biting her nails and sitting on the couch, bouncing back and forth as she sat, as her siblings left the house to go to school. When Heather's siblings returned home, they were informed Heather had left to accept a job that she had previously been refused in Torquay, although Rose told an inquiring neighbour that she and Heather had a hell of a row and that Heather had run away from home. Later, to answer their children's questions about why Heather failed to contact or visit, the parents claimed that Heather had eloped with a lesbian lover. When May and Stephen suggested they report Heather's disappearance to the police, Fred changed his story yet again, saying it would be unwise to initiate a search for Heather as she was involved in a credit card fraud. In the years following Heather's disappearance, Fred occasionally jokingly threatened that the children they would end up under the patio like Heather if they ever misbehaved or divulged the mistreatment they endured to anyone outside the house. With Rose's approval, he later constructed a barbecue pit immediately opposite where Heather had been buried and placed a pine table on her grave for the children of the family to sit upon whenever they held family gatherings in their garden. I mean, seriously, this is some level of sick. Heather's disappearance, Fred and Rose constantly changing stories about their daughter's whereabouts. It ultimately led to police inquiries as to Heather's whereabouts. These inquiries culminated in a search warrant being issued to excavate the West's garden in February 1994. Here we go. In May 1992, Fred asked his 13-year-old daughter Louise to bring some bottles to a room on the first floor of their home. Rose was not present in the home at the time. Shortly thereafter, the girl's siblings heard her scream, "No, don't." Later, Fred returned downstairs. Louise was found by her siblings, writhing in pain, sobbing that her father had raped and sodomized her. At one stage, partially strangling her. When Rose returned home, Louise confided in her mother that she had been raped by Fred. Rose replied, "Oh well, you were asking for it." Over the following weeks, Louise was raped on 3 further occasions, with Rose personally witnessing one of these rapes before following her distressed and bleeding daughter to the bathroom and asking the child, well, what did you expect? Fred also filmed one of these rapes. Several weeks later, Louise garnered the courage to confide in a close friend what her father had done. This friend told her own mother what happened on the 4th of August. In response, the friend's mother anonymously informed the police. At last, they didn't go running to the house. On the 6th of August 1992, the police searched the West's household on the pretext of searching for stolen property. Although numerous objects of sexual paraphernalia, including 99 pornographic videos of both homemade and commercial nature, were discovered, police did not find the video depicting the rape of Fred's daughter. The 13-year-old made a full statement through a specially trained solicitor describing her father's actions. The fact that the sexual abuse had begun when she was 11 and that her mother had been casually indifferent to her plight. All the children in the household were placed in foster care the following day. Medical examinations revealed evidence of physical and sexual abuse. The West children also divulged their mother had inflicted most of the physical abuse and that their father frequently said that if they told anyone about the goings-on in the house, they would be buried under the patio like their sister Heather. Police began a full-scale investigation, eventually leading to Fred being charged with 3 counts of rape and 1 of buggery? Sodomy. Okay. So it's sodomy, with Rose as an accomplice. She was also charged with child cruelty, inciting her husband to engage sex with their daughter, and obstructing the police. Fred and Rose were questioned as to the whereabouts of their eldest daughter, and although Fred claimed Heather was alive and well and supporting herself via prostitution, Rose initially claimed to have no knowledge of Heather's whereabouts or why she had left home. She claimed on the 11th of August that she could remember now that her daughter had left home at her own persuasion due to Rose's concerns. Her other children may discover Heather's supposed lesbian inclinations. Rose then added that she had also given her daughter £600 to incentivize her to leave the house, before further claiming to have maintained sporadic telephone contact with her daughter over the years. The following day, Rose was granted bail on the condition she did not maintain contact with her children, her stepdaughter, or her husband prior to her upcoming trial. As Fred awaited trial, he was held on remand in Birmingham. Learning that her father had denied any wrongdoing, Anna Marie also contacted the police to offer a full statement detailing her experiences as a child. In a statement given to Detective Constable Hazel Savage, Anna Marie recounted the extensive physical, mental and sexual abuse she had endured as a child at the hands of their father and stepmother. Before agreeing to testify against both parents at their upcoming trial, Anna Marie also added that she had for several years been unsuccessfully attempting to trace her mother, Rena, and her half-sister Charmaine, and Heather. Oh God. Further inquiries conducted with Anna Marie's husband, Chris Davis, revealed that Heather had confided in him just how unhappy she was shortly before her disappearance, and of her desire to leave home. The husband elaborated that although Heather had not divulged any detail about her enduring any sexual abuse, he had been so concerned for her welfare he had offered to confront Rose and Fred, and Heather had dissuaded him from doing so, blurting, "For Christ's sake, don't, because they'll kill us both." Chris then suggested they might wish to speak to Heather to garner further details of her abuse. In their efforts to gather further evidence, police and social services also spoke with May, who, having spoke with her 13-year-old sister Louise, did not wish to see her father charged. Initially denied she had endured any molestation as an adolescent. Police then focused their attentions on tracing Heather in efforts to corroborate Anna Marie's claims of sexual abuse, but inquiries to the Inland Revenue and the Social Security Department held no records attesting to her being alive. 2 months later, Gloucester Social Services also contacted police to stress their concerns over the whereabouts of Heather. Oh, now they're concerned. Sorry. This case against the Wests collapsed when Anna Marie and her 13-year-old half-sister Louise declined to testify at the court case on the 7th of June 1993, with the child rape victim expressing her desire to return to her family and Anna Marie choosing to withdraw her statement because of her noting the misery of her younger siblings and the fear of Rose's vindictiveness. Shortly thereafter, Anna Marie spoke further with DC Savage, further emphasising that her mother Rena and half-sister Charmaine were also missing. Although the Wests were acquitted of all charges, all their younger children remained in foster care, albeit with permitted supervised visitations to Cromwell Street. Despite Fred and Rose claiming to the new relatives of whom they were not already estranged in 1993 that the charges had been fabricated by the police, almost all of their remaining family members severed contact with them. Meanwhile, police continued investigating the disappearance of Heather, noting no records existed indicating that she was alive. When Anna Marie was questioned as to the, quote, family joke regarding Heather being buried beneath the patio, she confirmed that the sole time she had heard her father recite this claim, he had immediately burst into laughter, leading her refusing to take this claim seriously. In retracing Fred's history, police also discovered that although Rena and Charmaine had disappeared in 1971, no missing person report had ever been filed on either of them. Well, they wouldn't, would it? Rena maybe, but not Charmaine, because her parents done it. DC Savage and her colleagues were convinced Heather was dead, and that Fred's repeated statement to his children that her body lay beneath the family patio might be true. On the 23rd of February 1994, Gloucester Police successfully applied for a search warrant authorising the search of 25 Cromwell Street to locate Heather's remains. When police displayed this warrant to Rose on the 24th of February, she turned pale before becoming hysterical and shouting over her shoulder to her eldest son, Stephen, "Get Fred." Rose became contradictory in her informal questioning as to the circumstances surrounding Heather's disappearance. When reminded of these contradictions, she became distraught and abusive, shouting at the officers, "I can't beep remember. It was a bloody long time ago. What do you think I am? A bloody computer? Oh, really? Fred had been working in Strood at the time. Upon hearing of the police's intentions, he assured Stephen that he would be home immediately. When Fred arrived 3 hours later, he informed his family of his intention to voluntarily offer a witness statement to police regarding his daughter's whereabouts. Despite Fred's insistence in this statement that Heather had been alive and well, albeit involved in a drug cartel, just gets worse, and that the claims he and his wife had made as to Heather being buried beneath the family patio were simply rubbish. Police were unassured, I guess that word is. In response, Fred abruptly changed tactics, claiming that they simply held a grudge against him due to his 1993 acquittal of the rape of his daughter. Wow. That evening, with the search team having left their premises and a uniformed officer remaining at Cromwell Street to guard the excavation site, May and Stephen observed their parents talking in hushed tones as they repeatedly glanced towards the garden from their kitchen window. In the early hours of the following morning, as his son Stephen was about to leave for work, Fred informed him, "Look, son, look after Mum and sell the house. I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." Shortly thereafter, the police returned to Cromwell Street to continue their search for Heather's body. Upon their arrival, Fred indicated his wish to be arrested for Heather's murder and to be taken to Bear Land police station to provide a full confession. He was then arrested and formally cautioned. At 11:15 that morning, Fred formally admitted to police he had indeed killed his daughter, albeit in an act of manslaughter. He confessed to strangling Heather in a fit of rage, then dismembering her body in the ground floor bathroom with a heavy serrated knife he normally used for cutting slabs of frozen meat. Her remains had been stored in a dustbin as he waited for an opportunity to dig her grave. Fred was insistent his wife had no knowledge of her daughter's murder, claiming that he had committed the murder as Rose was preoccupied with one of her clients. Adding to the fact the search team had not yet unearthed Heather's remains was because they had been excavating in the wrong section of his garden. He then volunteered to accompany police to the house to pinpoint the precise location of Heather's body. Upon receipt of this confession, Fred's solicitor Howard Ogden and his appointed appropriate adult, Janet Leach, informed May and Stephen of their father had confessed to their sister's murder. In response, Stephen slumped against the wall and began sobbing. May entered a state of shock before stammering that her father had not killed her sister. The following day, on the 26th of February, police began excavating the section of the garden at Cromwell Street where Fred indicated he had buried his daughter's body. Shortly after 4 p.m, police found a human thigh bone protruding from a section of the garden. Fred had insisted the police not need look in. Excavating the section of the garden where Fred had indicated he had buried his daughter's body, investigators discovered a mass of jumbled human remains encased in the remnants of a bin bag and entwined with 2 lengths of rope. These dismembered remains were taken to police headquarters for further examination. When they were determined to be those of a young woman, one kneecap and several fingertips type bones missing. The fingernails were discovered in a pile, suggesting that they may have been torn off from her fingers as a means of torture. Several hours later, the body was identified via dental records as that being of Heather West. That evening, having been formally charged with his daughter's murder and questioned as to why, police had also discovered a third thigh bone. Fred confessed there were 2 further sets of human remains in his garden and agreed to return to Cromwell Street to reveal the location of both graves, one of whom he named as Shirley Robinson, whom he described as being a former tenant and a lesbian who was heavily pregnant with his child at the time of her 1978 murder. The other victim he described, incorrectly, as being Shirley's mate, but either could not or would not elaborate to her identity. Both sets of remains were discovered on the 28th of February, and Fred was charged with both murders 2 days later. Having discovered 3 sets of human remains in the garden, a decision was made to thoroughly search the entire property. Rose was placed into a safe house as police commenced their search inside 25 Cromwell Street. Informed of this fact, and with the formal interviews conducted by the investigative team lasting up to 16 hours each day, and including persistent questioning as to the whereabouts of his first wife Rena and stepdaughter Charmaine, Fred authorised his solicitor to pass a note he had written to the leader of the murder investigation, Superintendent John Bennett of the Gloucestershire Police. The note read, I quote, I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor Howard Ogden to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to a further, and then in brackets, approx. 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goff, and others to be identified. F. West. End quote. Questioned further as to his claims, Fred calmly explained that there were a further 5 bodies buried in his cellar and a 6th body beneath the ground floor bathroom. Most of these victims, Fred claimed, had been hitchhikers or girls he had murdered in the 1970s after picking them up at bus stops. Fred initially, claimed these 6 victims had been killed when they threatened to inform Rose of his infidelity with women, and that he had transported their bodies to Cromwell Street to abuse, dismember, and then bury in shallow graves. The dismemberment, Fred claimed, had made it easier to bury the remains in shallow, cubical graves, and he agreed to return to Cromwell Street to indicate precisely where he had buried each victim. Now, this is one thing I don't understand. Why do they keep taking him back to the house? If they're searching it anyway, and he's saying, oh, well, there's so many in the cellar, there's one under the floorboards in the bathroom. Why does he need to go there? Because surely he's I'm finger quoting, like getting off on that, isn't he? But anyway, between the 5th and 8th of March, police found 6 further bodies of young females at 25 Cromwell Street. Each victim had been extensively mutilated, and each body bore evidence of having been subjected to extreme sexual abuse prior to the act of murder. So I was just reading that. It said, for example, so I was just reading it. But, for example, the third set of remains discovered in the cellar was found with a length of cloth wrapped around the skull and an oval of adhesive tape 16 inches in circumference found with the remains had been likely used to gag this victim, whose ankles and wrists were also bound with a large section of rope. Also found in this grave was a large serrated knife. The second set of remains was found with a section of tubing twisted into a U shape alongside her severed limbs, and her skull was found encased in adhesive tape which had been wrapped around the section where her face had been 11 or 12 times, with a narrow plastic tube inserted where the nasal cavities had been. See, they're saying had been, was. This is how badly decomposed they were. It's horrific. And apologies. In an effort to allow her to breathe prior to murder. Each set of remains was missing numerous bones. When questioned, Fred refused to divulge the reason or whereabouts of the bones missing from each set of remains. Despite Fred's insistence that his wife held no knowledge of any of the murders, investigators suspected otherwise. Rose was arrested on the 20th of April 1994, initially on offences relating to the rape of an 11-year-old girl and the physical assault of an 8-year-old boy, both charges dating from the mid-1970s. The following day, she was refused bail and transferred to Puckle Church Prison to be held in the maximum security wing. Here she was questioned more closely about the murders, in particular those of her daughter Heather and Linda Goff, and on the 25th of April she was formally charged with Goff's murder. By May 6, Fred and Rose were jointly charged with 5 counts of murder, with Rose simply replying, "I'm innocent," upon hearing each formal charge, a response that proved to be a theme throughout the 46 interviews investigators held with Rose prior to her trial. 46 interviews. As well as the murders of the victims exhumed from Cromwell Street, Fred had confessed to the murder of his first wife and stepdaughter and to knowing the location of Anne McFall's remains, although he always denied killing her. Fred agreed to identify each burial location, and the remains were unearthed between the 10th of April and the 7th of June. He was then transferred to Birmingham's HM Prison, Birmingham, where a strict suicide watch called for his cell to be checked every 15 minutes. That worked out well. Formal charges. Fred and Rose West were brought before a magistrate's court in Gloucester on the 30th of June 1994. He was charged with 11 murders and she with 9. This was the first time the couple had seen each other since Fred's February arrest. Prior to hearing the formal charges against them, Fred leaned towards his wife and gently placed his hand upon her shoulder. In response, Rose, having ignored her husband's presence, visibly winced in discomfort. Both were held on remand. Well, she doesn't love him anymore because she's going to prison. As police attempted to lead Fred from the hearing, he resisted their efforts and again attempted to move towards Rose, who again winced and attempted to wither away from his grasp. Immediately after this court appearance, Fred was rearrested on suspicion of murdering Anne McFall, whose body had been found on the 7th of June. if you remember, she was in love with Fred. She was the nanny's friend, and she was 18 and 8 months pregnant with his child when he killed her. He was formally charged with her murder on the 3rd of July, appearing in court. Oh, she wouldn't have known about that, would she? That's why she's wincing. At Gloucester Magistrates Court on the 30th of June, her refusal to reply to letters he sent her and reports leaked to the press in which Rose had assumed the role of a grieving mother who lost a daughter and a stepdaughter to her husband, and in which she declared both her innocence of murder and the hatred of him. Fred pleaded with Stephen and Anna Marie, the only children, to visit their father while on remand, to convey to Rose that he loved her, but Rose never acknowledged these overtures. In response, Fred withdrew his earlier confessions to having acted alone in the murders, instead accused his wife of almost all culpability in all the murders to which he had been charged, excluding that of Anne McFall, which he claimed had been committed not by him, no, by his first wife. Initially, on the strict suicide watch having been relaxed on the 1st of January 1995, Fred West asphyxiated himself in his cell by wrapping an improvised rope he had constructed from a blanket and tags he had stolen from prison laundry bags around his neck, and binding this device to a door handle and a window catchment, and sinking to his knees. At the bottom of the suicide note, which I shall read in a second, found in his cell was a drawing of a gravestone within which was written, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West. Rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife." To Rose West, Steve and May. Well, Rose, it's your birthday on the 29th of November 1994, and you will be 41 and still beautiful. Really? And still lovely. And I love you. We will always be in love. The most wonderful thing in my life was when I met you. Our love is special to us, so love. Keep your promises to me. You know what they are. Where we are put together forever and ever is up to you. We loved Heather, both of us. That's not what it said earlier. And I would love Charmaine to be with Heather and Rena. You will always be Mrs. West all over the world. That is important to me and to you. Yeah, I bet. I haven't got you a present, but all I have is my life, and I will give it to you, my darling. When you are ready, come to me. I'll be waiting for you. Fred's suicide note. Yeah. At pre-trial proceedings in February, Rose pleaded not guilty to 10 charges of murder, the murder of Charmaine West having been added to the original 9 after Fred's suicide, and 2 counts of rape and indecent assault of young girls having been dropped with a view for later resubmission. Though her counsel conceded that circumstantial evidence indicated Rose's willingness to subject young girls to sadistic, physical and sexual abuse, her trial at Winchester Crown Court began the 3rd of October. An important early decision by the judge was to admit testimony related to the sexual mistreatment of 3 women by Fred and Rose, accepting the prosecution's argument that it established a pattern of behaviour repeated in the murders. Good call, Judge. Prosecution. In his opening statement, prosecutor Brian Levison portrayed Fred and Rose as sex-obsessed, sadistic murderers, terming the bodies discovered at Cromwell Street and Midland Road secrets more terrible than words can express. The victims' last moments on earth were as objects of the depravity of this woman and her husband. He pointed out that Fred was incarcerated when Charmaine West was killed, claimed that Fred and Rose had learned from their mistake in allowing Caroline Owens to live. They would never be so trusting again, and said that the gag on the victim, Teresa, we didn't sort of come across her, did we? It showed a feminine touch with a scarf tied in a bow. He promised to demonstrate Rose's controlling and sadistic character and her efforts to deflect suspicion about the disappearance of the victims. Rosemary's counsel tried to discredit prosecution witnesses as either having financially exploited their connection to the case or motivated by grudges. Caroline Owens was the one that was really badly abused, and then said, yeah, I still want to be the nanny, and then escaped, and then dropped her charges, and they got £50 fine each. I must add each. Owens, though admitting to receiving £20,000 for her story, described her extreme survivor's guilt. I only want to get justice for the girls who didn't make it. I feel like it was my fault. Ouch. It wasn't her fault. It was not her fault. It was Fred and Rose's fault. Ferguson emphasised that Fred, before meeting Rose, had committed at least one murder, strikingly similar to those at issue in the present trial, and that the prosecution's case was largely circumstantial. He contended that Rose was unaware of the extent of Fred's sadism and urged the jury not to be prejudiced by her sleeping around and domineering manner. Against the advice of her counsel, Rose herself testified. Her affect, sometimes morose and tearful, sometimes upbeat and humorous. She wept while she was describing herself as a victim of child abuse and rape, who naively married a violent and domineering man, but joked about issues such as her always being pregnant, quote, and laughed while describing one victim's, quote, grandfather glasses, end quote. She also claimed never to have met 6 of the victims buried at Cromwell Street, and to recall very little of her assault on Caroline Owens. When shown photographs of the victims buried in the cellar and victim Alison Chambers, and asked by Brian Levison whether she recognised any of their faces, Rose's face turned bright red and she repeatedly stuttered and replied, "No, sir." When questioned as to her life in Cromwell Street, Rose claimed she and Fred lived separate lives, which was inconsistent with earlier testimony of witnesses who had visited or lodged at their address. In reference to their relationship with their eldest child, Rose admitted her relations with Heather were strained, before claiming to the court that her daughter was a lesbian who... she's like... I'm getting annoyed now. Who had physically and psychologically abused her siblings. Despite these... I hope her kids are sitting in the jury, in the courtroom, listening to her deflect all this, because yeah. Despite these allegations, Rose stated that she had loved her daughter and held no knowledge of her murder. Further questioned as to the contradictory explanations she and Fred had given as to Heather's disappearance, Rose claimed that these discrepancies had stemmed from telephone conversations she had with Heather after she left home. Now that's a lie, isn't it? The defence next called a succession of women who claimed to have been attacked or assaulted by a lone male whose physical description matched that of Fred West between 1966 and 1975. These 7 women each testified they had recognised their attacker as Fred West when his photograph appeared in the media in 1994. The intention of this testimony was to illustrate to the jury that Fred was capable of abducting, assaulting, or attempting to attack women without Rose, which the prosecution had never disputed. The physical recollections of the several women varied greatly. The final witness to testify at Rose's trial was Fred's appointed appropriate adult, Janet Leach, whom from the prosecution had called to testify on the 7th of November in rebuttal to the tape recordings of Fred's confession, which had been played to the court on the 3rd of November, and in which he had stressed Rose had known nothing at all about the murders. Leach testified that throughout this role, Fred had gradually begun to view her as a confidant and had confided in her on the evening prior to his 25th February arrest. He and Rose had formed a pact whereby he would take full responsibility for the murders, many which he had privately described to her as being some of Rose's mistakes. He had further divulged that Rose had indeed murdered Charmaine while he was incarcerated and had also murdered Shirley Robinson. Fred had also confided that he had dismembered the victims, and Rose had participated in the mutilation and dismemberment of Shirley Robinson, having personally removed Robinson's unborn child from her womb after her death. In reference to the remaining 8 murders for which Rose was charged, Leach testified that Fred had confided Rose had played a major part, quote, in these murders. Conviction. After 7 weeks of evidence, the judge instructed the jury, emphasising that circumstantial evidence can be sufficient for finding guilt, and that if two people take part in a murder, the law considers them equally guilty regardless of which of them did the deed. On November 21 and November 22, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts for all 10 murders, terming her crimes appalling and depraved. The judge sentenced Rosemary to life in prison, emphasising that she should never be paroled. Initially, Rose was incarcerated at Bronzefield as a Category A prisoner. She was later transferred to Prison Low Newton before, in 2019, being transferred to HM Prison Newhall, where she continues to protest her innocence. So, there is a list here Fred and Rose West are known to have committed at least 12 murders. She was convicted of 10 between 1967 and 1987. Many of those connected to the case believe there are several other victims whose bodies have never been found. Prior to his suicide, police had recorded over 108 hours of tape-recorded interviews with Fred, both when he claimed to have acted alone in the murders and when he had attempted to portray Rose as being the more culpable. On several occasions, Fred made cryptic hints that he claimed several other victims, but refused to divulge any further information beyond that. He had murdered 15-year-old Mary Bastholm in 1968 and buried the body on farmland near Bishop's Cleeve. He also claimed to have killed one victim while working on a construction project in Birmingham, and that other bodies had been buried in Scotland and Hertfordshire. To his appropriate adult, I don't understand this. Is that because his IQ was so low? Why does Fred have an appropriate adult? Let me know in the comments. Fred claimed there were up to 20 further victims he and his wife had killed, not in one place but spread around, quote. And he intended to reveal the location of one body per year to investigators. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Or was that a TV show I saw? I think that was based on... That was Lie to Me, wasn't it? Anyway, moving on. While on remand, Fred made several admissions as to the fate of the victims buried at Cromwell Street to his son Stephen. I mean, how must them kids feel, really? Much of this information was disjointed or told in a third-party manner. Fred claimed that he had extensively tortured the victims prior to their murder, but he had not raped them, instead engaging in acts of necrophilia with their bodies at or shortly after the point of death. He also, that's something that you tell your child. He also claimed the reason that many of the bones had been missing from the victims' bodies was because the removal of their fingers and toes had been one of the forms of torture that the victims endured, with other torture methods including the extraction of their nails, acts of mutilation, and cigarettes being stubbed out on their bodies. Furthermore, the locations of almost all the burial sites of the victims, both discovered and undiscovered, was symbolic to Fred, as each had been buried at or very close to the location he had lived or worked in at the time of the victim's murder. There is a list here of victims and the year. I'm going to tell you the year, their name and their age, because we know who they are. If we don't, then I'll give you a quick description. Okay, so 1967, Anne McFall, 18. If you remember her, she was 8 months pregnant at 18. 1968, Mary Bastholm, 15. A teenage waitress at a cafe Fred frequented. That's how he knew her. 1971, Charmaine West, 8 years old. She was 8 when Rose killed her. That was in June. August, Rena Costello, 27. 1973, 20th of April, Linda Goff, 19. 10th of November, Carol Ann Cooper, 15. 27th of December. I mean, most people are still celebrating Christmas at this time. Lucy Partington, 21. She was a student. She wasn't really mentioned, but she was abducted from a bus stop. And Fred had to admit himself into a casualty unit at Gloucester Royal Hospital with a serious laceration on his right hand, probably sustained when he was dismembering her body, it says. 1974, Therese, I can't pronounce either of her names, I do apologise. She was 21, a sociology student, abducted by the Wests as she hitchhiked. 15th of November, Shirley Hubbard, 15, a foster child abducted from a bus stop. Yeah, 1975 is Juanita Mott, 18. 1978, Shirley Robinson, 18. 1979, Alison Chambers, 16. 1987, Heather West, 16. As well as the 12 confirmed victims, police firmly believe Fred is also responsible for a lot more, but they can't prove it. Okay, so aftermath. This is the impact these two, I mean, they haven't just taken their lives and affected their families. There's so much more to this, and it absolutely saddens me. Fred's body was cremated in Coventry on the 29th of March 1995. The service was held with only 4 family members present. In a 5-minute service, no hymns were sung. The Reverend Robert Simpson quoted sections of Psalm 23, then added a solemn reminder to those present that they must, quote, also remember everyone else who has suffered because of these tragic events, end quote. His ashes were scattered at the Welsh seaside resort of Barry Island, a location he regularly visited both as a child and as an adult with his family. After the 1994 arrest of their parents, the 4 youngest West children, born between 1978 and 1983, were given new identities to protect them from the notoriety of their family. Each child remained in foster care. I'm glad they got new identities. The remains of Charmaine and Rena were cremated in Kettering at the insistence of Anna Marie. Mother and daughter shared the same coffin, and no roses were to be brought to the service by any mourners. As a direct result of her tenacity in investigating the Wests, D.C. Hazel Savage was placed upon the annual New Year's Honours List. The following year she received an MBE. Fred's younger brother, John, hanged himself in the garage of his Gloucester home in November 1996. At the time of his suicide, he had been awaiting the jury verdict in his trial for the alleged multiple rapes of his niece, Anna Marie, at Cromwell Street in the 1970s. Oh my God. Obviously guilty like his brother. My goodness me. In March 1996, Rose announced her intentions to appeal her sentence, contending extensive press coverage had rendered witness testimony unreliable, that no physical evidence existed to attest she had participated in any of the murders, that the final instructions delivered by the judge to the jury had been biased in favour of the prosecution. Well, to be fair, I would have done the same thing. And that undue weight had been given to the similar fact evidence introduced at her trial. This appeal was rejected by Lord Chief Justice Taylor, who contended Rose had received a fair trial and efficient legal representation. In July 1997, the then Home Secretary Jack Straw subjected Rose to a whole life tariff. Yeah, that means she's never getting out, effectively denying her any possibility of parole. Rose again announced that she would appeal against her sentence via her solicitor in October 2000. In September 2001, she announced her intentions to cancel her appeals, stating she would never feel free even if she was released. Gee, you think? She maintains her innocence in any of the murders. Both of Rose's oldest biological children and her stepdaughter Anna Marie initially visited her in prison on a regular basis, although by 2006 she had ceased contact with them after May began asking questions about her responsibility in the murders. Rose justified her decision with the explanation, "I was never a parent then, and I could never be now." The sole visitor Rose continues to receive in prison is Anna Marie, who later changed her name to Anne Marie. Okay then. Now, some of you are going, oh my God, why would they still visit her? Abuse is a very, very tricky thing. And unless you've been in it, I'm just going to leave it there because, Now, the body of the West's former friend and housemate, Terence Crick, was found in his car at the Scarborough district of Hackness in January 1996. He was 48 years old. Now, we've not heard about him at all in any of this 2-hour WIPnChat. But he had lived at Lake House Caravan Park in 1969. That's where he moved to with, I think, Anne, if I remember correctly. But West had moved there. And Terence Crick had reported Fred to the authorities on several occasions. After having been shown surgical instruments Fred claimed to have used to perform illegal abortions and Polaroid images of lady parts, he claimed to have taken immediately after the procedures. Terence had further informed authorities Fred had asked him to assist in finding pregnant girls to perform abortions upon. So they're not even willingly. Nothing in this man's life is done with anyone being willing. Anyway, Terence had believed the information he had provided to the police was ignored, as Fred was known as a police informant. The stress and guilt Terence Crick had felt over the fact the information he had provided had not resulted in charges being brought apparently led Terence Crick to take his own life. An inquest later recorded a verdict of suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Now again, this guy tried to tell the police that he's performing abortions on unwilling pregnant females, and now he feels bad because the police didn't do anything about it, and he went on to commit all the other heinous acts, and he feels bad. It's so tragic. He did the right thing. It was Fred West and Rose West that did these things. In 2004, one of the West's youngest children, Barry, claimed to have witnessed the murder of his sister Heather. According to Barry, he was 7 at the time, Fred and Rose had restrained, then sexually and physically abused Heather before Rose had repeatedly stamped upon her head until she ceased to move. The West house in Cromwell Street was demolished in October 1996, and I remember this happening. With every piece of debris destroyed to discourage potential souvenir hunters. There's some weird people out there. It has been referred to in the press as the House of Horrors. Yeah, that's how I know it, because it's what I grew up. The site was later redeveloped into a public pathway. In 1999, Anna Marie West attempted suicide by drowning herself in the River Severn. Stephen West is also known to have made an unsuccessful suicide attempt in 2002 by attempting to hang himself. In 2004, he was jailed for 9 months for having unlawful sex with a 14-year-old girl on multiple occasions. The couple's youngest son, Barry, committed suicide via a suspected drug overdose in October 2020, 2 months ago. He is known to have battled a drug addiction and psychiatric. Cindy, you're at the end now. Say the word. Psychiatric. Is it psychiatric? Psychiatric. There you go. Issues as a result of the abuse he witnessed and endured as a child. Everyone who was close to the family are all trying to commit suicide. It's so sad. But that is the pure evil and absolutely disgusting story of Fred and Rosemary West. And I'm sitting here and I'm in disbelief that Barry died in October 2020. 2 months ago, guys. And his mum sitting in jail going, but I didn't do anything. Anyway, so thank you for joining me. I hope you have got a lot of your project done. If you have made it to the end of this episode, I applaud you. And let me know down below, because yeah, it's graphic. it's disgusting. And yeah, that is the story of Fred and Rose West. So I thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you want to join me for more Thriller Thursdays, then please hit that subscribe button. If you have any suggestions, as this one was suggested to me, I have taken several times to actually get it done because it was so disgusting and hits a few nerves. But there we go, it is done. And I don't want to say I hope you enjoyed, but I hope I held your interest. There you go. And thank you for joining me. I am sending you lots and lots of love, lots and lots of hugs. I hope you have enjoyed spending time with me, and I shall see you in the next episode. Bye for now, guys.